is William Bradford, from Aylesbury in England, and then on to Leiden in Holland, and for the rest of my life in Plymouth, Massachusetts, one of the original pilgrims. I'm here to share with you the struggles and challenges that we faced because of our faith and our desire to find the place and the opportunity to worship and to fulfill God's call upon our lives. King James was quite clear in 1603 that only one way to worship was possible, and it was through the Church of England, his way. And we became extremely frustrated. We felt there was impurities in the life of the church, and we wanted to separate ourselves from these impurities and worship as the scriptures taught us so to understand. I was born in 1590, and at the age of 4 my father died, and so I went to live with my grandfather, who passed away a few years later. I was returned to my mother and my stepfather, and then she passed away when I was 7. So I was like an orphan. Lived with my 2 uncles for a while and found that they were extremely abusive. And so I began to be attracted to the group of separatists who were meeting in Scrooby under the preaching of Reverend Clifton, and found there the warmth and the love and support of the community. And William Brewster began to take me under his wing and to treat me as his own son, and taught me to read and to understand the teachings of the faith and the scriptures. And so I found myself drawn more and more to the group called Separatists. And we were meeting in secret because those who were not of the Church of England could be arrested for their faith. There were about 50 of us who gathered together in the post office home in Scrooby on the Sabbath day to worship. And as the persecution increased, we thought that perhaps if we went on to Holland, where there was a great deal of spiritual and religious freedom, we might have the opportunity to be faithful to our call from God, to be faithful participants. We gathered what little money we had and purchased a journey across over to Holland, and the captain of the ship loaded his ship with soldiers, and so when we came to board, we were all arrested and spent several weeks in prison until we might come up with a bribe to allow us to be released. And so it took us nearly 3 years of planning and in secrecy to get up the courage and to find a captain who would take us across the English Channel, who understood and would have sympathy for us. And so we moved to Amsterdam. But there, because we were strangers and foreigners and had used up all of our resources to get to Amsterdam, the only jobs we could have were the lowest. And many of us had to join in together and staying in each other's houses in terrible conditions, or even living out on the street. And after a couple of months of being in Amsterdam, we moved to Leiden. There was a university there, and William Brewster could have a position as a professor. I had become a weaver, and the making of fabric was very important, and so I had a job. And when I turned 21, I inherited my parents' estate. And so that allowed me to have some resource to share with the community. And then I met Dorothy, and we married, and we had a son. But as my son began to grow older, and as the other children of our community in Leiden became more and more like Dutch children, and not English children, it became a concern to us about what might become of our community. And then we found that because we had worked so hard, we were aging more rapidly, and found that even the strongest among us were soon becoming overwhelmed by the tasks and challenges. And then the King of Spain began to rumble about attacking Holland, because it was the one country without a king. And so we began to fear for our lives once more, and began to talk about the possibilities of moving across the Atlantic to a new promised land, the New World. Now, there were many in our midst who wrestled with that possibility. Some of us thought that, like Moses calling us across a great and vast desert, we would find a promised land that God had given to us. Others recounted their knowledge and understanding of the difficulties of a journey across the sea. And knowing that if we got over to a wilderness, there were savages in the woods, we had heard. And there would not be any warm inns to welcome us or to shelter us. And we thought it difficult, and we had not the resources. But we prayed, and we recognized that for all of the dangers and fears and concerns we had, they couldn't all possibly come true. And we began to remind ourselves that Scripture promises that when we seek first the kingdom of God, all the things we need will be provided. And if we place our life in God's hands, perhaps many of the conditions that we were so concerned about would be taken care of by the divine gift of providence. And we also determined that much of our struggle and anxieties could be determined with good planning. That if we looked at all the possibilities and sorted through what we would need to get there and prepared ourselves for it, it might not be quite as dangerous as some of our naysayers had said. And so as a community we prayed and felt that it was the call of God to lead us to a new promised land. We became pilgrims on a journey of faith. Because I had some connections with merchants in England, John Carver and I would travel over to London and make arrangements for the possibility of a passage to the New World. We gathered together from the resources of our community enough money to buy a little boat called a Speedwell, and we sailed from Amsterdam to Plymouth and prepared to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. In the middle of the summer, when we were getting ready to go, it was not so bad. But the Speedwell was a ship much in need of help, and it leaked. It leaked precipitously, and so after 2 false starts, we had to return to Plymouth and determined that the only way we could get there was to combine all of the passengers from both ships into the Mayflower. Now, the Mayflower was a vessel for carrying wine and had been used in such a fashion. It was not very big, 100 feet long, 26 feet wide, a crew of 30, and a passenger list of 102. We found ourselves having to consider that some would remain behind and we would go and set the way. We considered that we wanted to get where we wanted to go, and half of our fellow passengers were not members of our church, but were those who were adventurers and soldiers and those who were seeking their fortune or who had indentured themselves to serve the adventurers, investors in London. And so in September of 1620, we set sail in the Mayflower. Now at first it was a beautiful voyage, and we made good timing, and then as we got into the middle of September, and it took us 65 days to cross the Atlantic at that time, the northwest winds began to blow and to buffet the ship. And we began to worry about our safety, and there was one crew member who abused us and insulted us and cursed us precipitously and constantly. And God had providence one day to make him deathly ill. And so all the cursing he had dumped upon us fell upon him. And so none of the passengers passed away on the ship. And as a matter of fact, we had Oceanus born on our way over, and Peregrine was born when we got to the harbor at the other side. The main beam in the ship began to crack halfway across the Atlantic. And we began to wonder, had God brought us out here for this disaster? When William Brewster, who was a printer, said that if we turned the screw that's used to press the paper to ink in the opposite direction, it could be raised to be a support for the beam in the ship. And so we did that. And lo and behold, God provided and all was secure, and we finished our journey. But the storms had blown us way off course. Our contract in England had given us Northern Virginia as our destination. And at the time, Virginia extended to the Hudson River. And we were blown further north off course. And on November 19th of 1620, we recognized land as Cape Cod. And thought we would wait too far north and tried desperately to sail south. And as we got near Chatham, the sand barges were overwhelming and it nearly broke the Mayflower up. And so Captain Christopher Jones turned the boat around and we headed for harbor, what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts. And there on December 20th dropped anchor and began to thank God for the journey across. And then we determined that since we were no longer in territory that we had a contract for, that we must form some kind of politic, some government that would guide us. And so we wrote up the Mayflower Compact, and all 53 men signed it, including those who were not the saints, but who were also servants or strangers. But the men agreed that we would all work together, and that especially with winter coming on, that was the most appropriate thing to do, and the women and children would go along. It was my responsibility to begin to take a small boat and explore the bay, to find some place where we might actually unload and set up camp. And it took us 3 trips around the Cape Cod to find the appropriate place, and finally, in December 21st, we found the tributary that entered into the bay at about where Plymouth is now, and determined that the land was good. It had already been cleared by previous inhabitants, and we thought this might be a good place for us. When I got back from that journey to announce that we had found the place where we could settle in, my wife Dorothy had fallen overboard and drowned. It was just the beginning of a very difficult winter. We set sail across the Cape and landed at Plymouth and unloaded and began to build shelter. But it was a fierce winter, and we got but one house completed, and all of us were staying in it, and sooner or later it began that 1 or 2 a day would die from exposure or pneumonia or starvation. We would go out in the fields and try to clear some land and would come back in for an evening meal, and when we would return, the tools had been stolen. And so we knew we were being watched and had to be very careful. And so to avoid those who were out there, and we had not met them yet, to know how strong we really were, we buried our dead in the dark and in unmarked graves so that they did not know how many of us were there. By late February of 1621, there were but 8 men left, and 23 women, and some children. Nearly half of those who had set sail across in the Mayflower were still alive. March 21st, we began to see the signs of spring, and so we went out and began to dig, to plant something that might grow. When lo and behold, out from the woods walked Samoset, a native who spoke English, and addressed us and said, "I have one who I know can help you," and brought Squanto to us. And Squanto became a gift of salvation. He taught us how to plant crops and to place fish into the rows of corn so that it might have the moisture needed in that rough New England ground, and taught us where the clean water could be found and how to fish. Squanto was truly a gift from God. And an amazing story in Squanto. He had been captured by English sailors in the 1590s and sold as a slave in Spain. And the friars in Spain bought him to help set him free and gave him a faith like our faith. And the friars helped him to escape to England, and he talked to sea captain into bringing him back across the Atlantic in the early 1600s so that he was available to help us. And so in 1621, the weather began to turn, and Squanto began to help and introduce us to Massasoit and the Indians. And they returned our tools and established a treaty and began to help us. And when the fall of 1621 came, we began to have a harvest. And we felt that because God had provided for us and the promise of a return of the Mayflower with even more of our people began to uplift our spirits, and we determined that we would have a feast of Thanksgiving. And so the 53 pilgrims who were left broke bread together and laid out a table and declared a day of Thanksgiving. And Massasoit brought 90 tribesmen with him to join into the feast. But fortunately, they brought food with them. And so our feast was a blessing of corn and venison and turkey and fish and lobster and a variety of other things that could be found with berries and potatoes and bacon that had still been left, eaten very small portions at a time since when we came over. But we were grateful. God had provided for us, and soon after our Thanksgiving, the ship returned with even more, and we began to grow and to build and to be blessed. You can read the story for yourself. It's called On Plymouth Plantation. John Carver died in March. He was our governor and leader, and they elected me as the next governor. And then re-elected me every year for the next 30 years. And so I'm grateful to have been a part of the understanding of God's provisions and equipping and encouraging us. And I would pray that you face the same circumstances. There are difficulties in your life or challenges that you know not what will bring. And I would encourage you, as I encouraged our fellow pilgrims, that in prayer and in preparation and in putting things into God's hands, great things could come of it. Even in the midst of suffering, we would discover that God was with us and blessed us. And it's often in the most difficult times that we turn our attention most to God and find God's strength and help in every present time of need. And so we give thanks. And I encourage you to continue to gather together with family and friends in your church and give thanks to God who provides for us so well. Now may God's grace and peace and encouragement be with all of you. Good day.